Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another session of Islamic Authors with myself, Usaama al-Azami, and it really gives me immense pleasure to welcome a colleague and a friend, someone I consider a friend and a mentor in some ways, even though we've not spent as much time as I'd like to with you. Madawi Al-Rasheed, Dr. Madawi Al-Rasheed is a visiting professor at the moment at the London School of Economics, but she has many sort of academic accolades behind her. She has for a long time been a professor of anthropology and of religion at King's College London. She was also a prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, and even as far as the National University of Singapore. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Madawi, and hopefully discuss with you two of your books and perhaps some others as we can fit in the discussion. So the first of these two, chronologically speaking, is Muted Modernists, The Struggle Over Divine Politics in Saudi Arabia. So something which I used in my own book, my more recently published book. So this was published originally in 2015 and published a couple of years ago now, I think, The Sun King, Reform and Repression in Saudi Arabia. So this is very much about MBS's Saudi Arabia. So with that brief introduction, and I could go on for a long time, I wanted to start this conversation, if it's all right with you, Madawi, by asking your motivations, and these are two different books written over a period of around 5 or 6 years, your motivations for writing these books and what you hope people would take from them.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much, Usaama, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to discuss my work and make it available to a wider audience. Yes, I think there are two books and possibly two different motivations. Muted Modernist, I started that book as a progression from earlier work that I did. I have always fascinated by the Islamic tradition and the diversity within the Islamic tradition. The multiple voices, the methodology used to interpret it, the texts. I love the language of the classical Arabic, and also the way various ulama and Islamic thinkers excavate these texts. I haven't done it myself, and probably in another life, if I had an opportunity, I probably would like to train as alima, because the tradition fascinates me. It's a fascination that stems probably from my upbringing in Saudi Arabia, where I was exposed to it at a young age. But specifically, Muted Modernist was triggered off by my interest in politics and how Islam and Muslim authors, whether they are ulama trained in the classical schools or they are intellectuals, have responded to the years of repression in the Arab world, and specifically in my home country, Saudi Arabia. As you know, Saudi Arabia had a dominant religious tradition under the umbrella of the state, namely the Wahhabi tradition. And it is a tradition that is sprung out of a particular geography in Central Arabia. It claims authenticity. It doesn't like to be called the Wahhabi tradition. It wants to be referred to as a Salafi tradition or Islam, full stop. So I was interested in how that tradition sustained a political structure, a monarchy, which, according to my reading of Islamic history, there wasn't really anything in Islamic texts which justifies and defends monarchical rule. And it is that moment in Islamic history where conflicts and war erupted, when Muslims moved from the prophetic tradition with the death of the Prophet to the Khulafa al-Rashidun. And that critical moment continued to be felt by Muslims all over the world. and more so in Saudi Arabia. So I thought, how do the ulama of the Wahhabi tradition justify monarchical rule? How do they justify being marginalized and sidelined in the political affairs of the Ummah, as they call it? And I came across a group of authors, a group of ulama. Some of them are ulama, such as Sheikh Salman al-Auda.
Right.
Others would probably be referred to as Mufakkir Islami, that is, people who hadn't had the scholastic education, but are conversant in it and are able to discuss it.
Right.
And I wanted to see what this new trend is represented by multiple authors. Some of them are well known, as I mentioned, and others are young intellectuals.
Right, right. So this gives us a really fascinating sort of view into this particular book, and I'm very tempted to spend sort of the first half of this discussion thinking about this book in particular. Maybe we'll see sort of like whether maybe less than half, considering the differing sizes of the two books as well. But you raise a number of fascinating points that I spend a lot of time mulling over and thinking about the theoretical sort of like grounding for. I ask myself very often, what is an alim? So many people write about the ulama. I can think of Malik al-Zayghal, you can think about Qasim Zaman, with whom I studied in Princeton. But a whole host of writers are writing about this class known as the ulama. But what constitutes an alim? And who sets the parameters that legitimate that category? And how has that category transformed in the modern era? Is an alim today meaningfully comparable to someone like Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in the medieval era, who were very often sort of these important figures, even in the political classes? They were advisors to kings, but also critics of kings at times. So I perhaps you can comment on that, but I particularly wanted to highlight one particular point that you just mentioned, that this is a very male-dominated area. This is something we were also discussing before we started, and it's not an opportunity that women are generally afforded. I wanted to ask you two questions in relation to that. Saudi Arabia, ilm is of course valorized in male circles, definitely. Are there no real opportunities for women to train as alimat? And the other question is that, what do you think that does to the nature of a discursive tradition, to use an Assadian phrase, that in its current guise at the very least has been excluding sort of female voices from participating, so to speak?
Yes, the alim, to begin with, is anybody who acquires or has ilm, knowledge. Right. And I think the early years of the Islamic tradition, there wasn't really a class called the ulama. It is a phenomenon that developed later on, because as Muslims, my understanding is that we are all required to know the Islamic tradition. But there are different categories of knowledge. So I think throughout Islamic history, the role of the qadi, the judge, is extremely important, rather than the alim. But obviously, with the development of the modern post-colonial states, and even Saudi Arabia, which doesn't really qualify as a post-colonial state, the ulama is something new, because there were people who specialized in religious knowledge and in ifta', that is issuing religious decrees, to solve problems, to give opinions on certain issues that happen in modern life or in life decades and centuries ago. Marriage, divorce, trade, commerce, travel to other countries, there are a whole range of areas. Relations between men and women, marriage and divorce, inheritance, all of that. So perhaps everybody should know the Islamic tradition, but not everybody has sufficient knowledge to issue an opinion, depending on the Islamic school they subscribe to.
Right.
And therefore, in this particular situation with modern times, I think women had been marginalized, because we do have in the Islamic tradition, important women who gave opinion, Aisha, for example,
Right.
and many others. But their role stopped at that historical moment, and it became very difficult for women to penetrate this male-dominated field with actually modernization of the state. And therefore, there are opportunities for women to learn the Islamic tradition in the religious curriculum, and even go and enter higher education, studying religious studies. But to have official women issuing fatwas, issuing religious opinions at an institutional level, that hasn't developed, unfortunately. And therefore, the tradition and its advocates are male, unfortunately, until the present day.
Right. I mean, if you'll allow me, I'll sort of perhaps complicate some of the early sort of discussion about a class of ulama, and particularly the role of women. I mean, I do think that in many respects, the present situation is that women are significantly marginalized in a way, actually, which is not necessarily characteristic of the pre-modern era. And the reason I think that is partly because I'm a student of a scholar. I don't know if you've heard of Muhammad Akram Nadwi. He's actually an Alim. He's one of my main teachers in Ilm Shar'i, so to speak. But he was also at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies for a long time, and he spent a lot of the last 30 or so years working on an encyclopedic sort of biographical dictionary of, if I recall correctly, 42 volumes. Apologies about my son. I have toddlers in the house who might be shouting in the background, so they might occasionally be heard. But Sheikh Akram basically has published a 42-volume biographical dictionary called Al-Wafa bi Asma'in Nisa. 42 volumes of female scholars of Hadith only. I mean, this is actually exclusively Hadith. So he in a short book that he's published in English in a single volume, Al-Muhaddithat, he points out that other disciplines may well have plenty of women. I suspect that women are overrepresented in Hadith studies for particular reasons, including female longevity allowing for shorter isnads, for example. But I think that there has been historically a great deal of vibrancy, and he seems to suggest that perhaps around the 15th century onwards, you have this kind of decline, and I think I'm not a particularly well-informed scholar on the gendered history of Islamic learning, but that seems to suggest that there's something going on today.
Yes, but also I have come across volumes published in the Hijaz about it's under the title Alimat al-Hijaz, and these were women who specialized in issuing religious opinions, and they had their study circle. And you can imagine in a segregated society where men and women don't actually mix. And in Saudi Arabia, historically, the women were not actually seen in mosques at all, not even for prayer. It's very unusual. So the study circle was at home and with these alimat. But as you say, yes, I totally agree that we had seen a decline in this tradition with the advent of state institutions and formalized sort of fatwa and religious opinions. We see a serious decline in the role of women. But we also see on the margins, or if you like, the periphery of the Muslim world, in countries where there are substantial Muslim minorities, in the West, in the US, the re-emergence of the female voice in the Islamic tradition, if not in the mosque or in the religious circle, it's definitely in publication and in and commentaries.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the academic space is one of these areas where there's a kind of efflorescence going on currently, and I just, when I read some of this literature, it makes me think, these aren't conversations and questions that would have been raised by male scholars very often, and so there's a considerable loss in that marginalization of the female voice in scholarship, even if many male scholars of a traditional mold might disagree with some of these sort of takes, so to speak, in some of this literature. They should be seriously considering it, grappling with it, engaging it, and those who complain that all of these female voices who are coming from the West are in some respects they're basically complicit in the suppression of those voices in their local areas, and dismissive of voices that might be coming from other parts of the world. But I think that those dismissals can only go so far when there are substantive critiques leveled at the way in which certain scholars might be addressing the tradition. And particularly, as you've noted, in Saudi Arabia, there's in some respects, a hyper-segregated sort of culture, which of course, this maybe is a good segue to speak briefly about MBS as well. I know we're transitioning from book to book, but he is to a certain extent tapping into a kind of counter-misogyny, the sort of misogyny that is talked about by people like Lila Abu Lughud in her book Do Muslim Women Need Saving. He's tapping into those prejudices in a Western audience, to sort of say, look, I'm a reformer, I'm letting women drive, and therefore you should sort of like celebrate me. And so you have an interesting take on this, because you, of course, see it as very important that women have a voice in Saudi society, but at the same time, this is tokenism of the worst kind, in your view. I just wonder if you wanted to briefly talk about that.
Yes, well, in the book Muted Modernists, to just bring the story to the other one, is I came across these authors who are trying to interpret Islam in ways that free the soul, free the political sphere from repression, calling for civil society. As you know, Saudi Arabia prided itself for decades on Hay'at al-Amr bil-Ma'ruf wal-Nahy an al-Munkar, which is the committee that was institutionalized at the beginning of the 20th century, and it is the committee for commanding good and prohibiting evil. And this was almost like a caricature of Hisbah, simply because Hisbah, the accountability. It had a caricature sort of presence in the public sphere, because there were almost more than 5,000 employees whose job was to roam the streets, look for immoral behavior or mixing between the sexes, looking for alcohol consumption or any kind of behavior that is regarded as an aberration. And therefore, people thought that, well, this is commanding right and prohibiting evil, because this is an institutionalized way of doing the obligation of Hisbah. Then you have other scholars, such as, for example, Abdullah al-Hamid, when he established a civil society, Association of Civil and Political Rights in Saudi Arabia. He said, well, al-Hisbah is civil society. It's not mutawwa. Al-mutawwa is the local word for the ulama. It's not a ulama. Is really the employee of this committee is not ulama. He is an enforcer of certain abstract concept in order to purify the public sphere from signs of blasphemy or sins, etc. So Abdullah al-Hamid says, well, this is not Hisbah. Hisbah is civil society. It's a space between state and society that every person must play that role in order to protect society from the excesses of power. from corruption, from making the wrong decisions. It is basically you as a Muslim inserting yourself as an active agency in order to observe and hold those in power accountable.
Right.
So this is a real revolution, I would say, in a Saudi context, whereby the king employs those mutawa, the plural of mutawwa, who is supposed to force a certain behavior on the individual. And therefore, we get into the concept of civil society out of this muted modernist. So again, the muted modernists looked at this driving issue that had occupied the minds of Western commentators and Saudis. Why is it that Saudi Arabia alone in the Muslim world prohibits Muslims from Muslim women from driving cars? So you get the absurd scholastic position that defends the prohibition, and also an absurd position that makes it lawful. So the absurd one, which says we justify it, is a concept of sadd al-dhara'i.
Right.
Sadd al-dhara'i is you prohibit something in order to prevent something worse happening. Although it's not haram, it's not prohibited. So if you don't let women drive, then you are actually protecting the Muslim community from a grave sin, from temptation, from all sorts of transgressions. Right. On the other hand, those who say, no, Islam allows women to drive because, look, during the Prophet time, women were riding camels, but they have to go a certain distance, and that's okay. Beyond that, for safar, for travel, then you can't because it's dangerous. But now, with the state and its policing agencies, the roads are safe, therefore we can allow women to drive. So the two are fixed in this sort of absurd justification, in my view. Right. But you get other serious scholars who argue that within the Islamic tradition, we have to separate what is prohibited from what is socially unacceptable. So in a country like Saudi Arabia, with its own social, tribal background, etc., there are things that are prohibited because of social tradition, of thaqafa, of culture. And these prohibitions had crept and impacted the way Muslim scholars interpret certain issues, such as driving. So those scholars, for example, Sheikh Salman al-Uda wants a separation between what is halal and what is haram if we have a nas, a text, and what is social, what is cultural, depending on each context. So probably in another country where there isn't a strong tribal ethos, you wouldn't have this issue raised, and you would have women being allowed to drive a long time before Saudi Arabia. But if we go to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, we find that women had actually used civil society in order to campaign for allowing them to drive, using multiple justifications. Some of them resorted to Western norms, saying that this is the right to movement is important and it is guaranteed by international human right law. Others said that no, let's separate what is cultural from what is religious, and then we can allow women to drive. But he didn't want civil society in the country because it was linked to a growing feminist movement, and wanted to take all the credit that any reform that takes place emanate from the center, not from society. And it's a gift of the monarch to people, rather than a result of people's struggles and demands. And then we get to this situation when women were allowed to drive. In 2018, the feminists who called for driving were put in prison.
So Lujain al-Hadlul and others, of course, were sort of basically imprisoned, and indeed the scholars who were advocating for the right of women to drive were also imprisoned at the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, I mean, what's really interesting to me is, the engagement that you're conducting with the religious tradition. Now, because I was trained in a kind of, I'm trained in Oriental Studies in my department at Oxford, and then I did Near Eastern Studies. It was very philologically oriented, kind of very different to, I think, the approach that is typical in anthropology departments. And I understand you did your doctorate in anthropology at Cambridge.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, your mentor Qasim Zaman is a very, very interesting author, and I actually love the way he engages with the Islamic tradition. But of course, you and him come to it from a textual exegesis from the tradition. But I come to the Islamic tradition from a social science background, from history and also from anthropology. I had always been fascinated as an anthropologist by the diversity of Muslim societies. And in a way, I was very critical of the early anthropological work on Muslim societies. Let's face it, a lot of the early Western anthropologists didn't actually speak the languages of the Islamic tradition. Maybe they could converse in Ammiya, in the colloquial language of the countries where they did their studies or field work. But not most of them, I would say, with very few exceptions, could actually read the texts. And they imagined, so for example, my professor, when I was a student at Cambridge, Ernest Gellner, he definitely couldn't read a word of Arabic. And he did his work in Morocco, among the Berbers.
My wife is from, incidentally.
Oh yes, right. And he couldn't even converse in Berber, let alone Arabic, and he had to go through an interpreter. So his idea of Islam, of Muslim societies, is that there is this high Islam, the language of the ulama, that is completely detached from society. And as an anthropologist, he was interested in popular Islam, the Islam of the Marabut, the Sufi orders, and wanted to explain how these two traditions, high Islam and low Islam. And I came to this thinking that even the most illiterate person in the Muslim world could actually converse in the Islamic tradition. And this dichotomy is wrong because he got it wrong. And he was my professor, but he did get it wrong.
Of course, I mean, a whole tradition of scholarship, of course, in the Assadian school in particular, has been built on critiquing that sort of Geertzian and Gellnerian sort of approach to these questions. And I think, in a sense, it reflects I mean, it's maybe a little sort of like harsh to say this, but disciplines like our own disciplines do recognize the colonial origins of a lot of these disciplines, the colonial roots, and that's why, whether it's Oriental Studies, my own department, or Anthropology of Islam in particular, like there's an identity crisis in these disciplines, like.
Absolutely, yes. But I mean, within anthropology, it started from the 1970s that anthropologists began to be aware how their theoretical models and their way of analyzing these societies was actually dominated by these Orientalist views.
It took us a little longer.
But I think we have to acknowledge, in my case, that reading anthropological studies of Muslim societies from Morocco all the way to Afghanistan, then among Muslims in Bradford or Muslims in Chicago, and also having lived and traveled outside my small circle, I had been exposed to ways of being Muslim. That are really anchored in culture. And unless you're a dogmatic person, you can't really just dismiss them as un-Islamic practices. Islam, and I thought, there are multiple ways of being Muslim. There is a core, but you could be Muslim in ways that reflect your cultural background, their specific context.
this is where the conversation, I think, gets very interesting, because basically, when you're trained in the theological tradition or the legal tradition, you very often have these paradigms of thinking which, render this kind of, the cultural variation almost unintelligible at times. But and I have a colleague who I also interview, who you may be familiar with, Omar Anshasi, and the first sort of a series of books that we discussed on this channel, because he's a voracious reader of our field, is Lived Islam by Kevin Reinhardt. So it's a relatively recent book. And he talks about different sort of levels of Islam, and I think that's an interesting model to look at this.
Yeah.
The theologian, of course, or I forget the label he gives, and it's far more sensitive than someone who like Gellner, of course. But the theologian is dealing with a discourse of Islam which is basically like he uses a linguistic sort of like analogy. It's the standard received pronunciation version of the of Islam, and you have various kinds of koine and I forget and dialect. And local areas have kind of dialect. Now, I mean, theologians point out that if you accept La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, you are a Muslim at a minimal level. But then, there are sort of specificities to these discourses which, just to, take the example, one of the examples you mentioned, Sadd al-Dhari'a, or Sadd al-Dhara'i', as a mechanism used in Usul al-Fiqh to, create a hukm shar'i, or a legal ruling on a certain case. And the origin of this comes from a verse in the Quran, فَلَا تَسُبُّوا الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ غَيْرَ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّوا اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. I should know this better, but in any case, I mean, you get the idea that don't curse the sort of the idols of the people who are worshipping them, and they will, in retaliation to that, out of their ignorance, start cursing God because they don't really know what they're doing. And so that's seen as Sadd al-Dhari'a, because it's not technically wrong to curse idols. In a sense, God himself is condemning the idols in the Quran. But the question is, when we get to that granular level of theological discourse, and this is where I think this discussion is so valuable, there will be points of potential conflict, right? There will be points of disagreement. And if you'll allow me to take one example from your book, The Sun King, it just struck me for a moment, and I forget which page it is, but you mentioned the fact that Al-Ula and Madain Salih and these sorts of places are now sort of being recreated as tourist destinations. And you said that, previously they had been basically left in abeyance. No one took them seriously. In fact, they were actively avoided, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And for me, I thought that was an interesting observation, but at the same time, I'm familiar with a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim which legitimates that. And so for me, it was like, but there's actually a reason for that. It's not just irrational superstition. And then we get to the question of, okay, how do we even define superstition? Because in a secular order, Bukhari and Muslim is superstition as well, right? And so I think,
but I think it's the conflict between Ahl al-Fiqh and Ahl al-Hadith.
I mean,
the people who follow jurisprudence and the people who follow the sayings of Prophet.
Which Salman al-Awda famously has a book about, of course, right? I mean,
yes, and also many others. Al-Ghazali, the modern Ghazali, is a title of his famous book. And also Khalid Abul Fadl talks about that in the U.S. And for me is anthropologically interesting. So if the Islamic tradition from the very beginning, it emerged in a place where there were idols everywhere and spread across the world. And yes, the Prophet did smash the idols, but Madain Salih and Al-Ula and the Bamyan, the Buddhist thing, they remained intact throughout those years. So why is it in modern times, then in Egypt, the pyramids, the Sphinx, Abu Simbel, all of those, they remained, and even when they were discovered, nobody went and blew them up. But what has happened with the Islamic tradition that act which had actually been sustained by the Saudi religious scholars, to say that if you shouldn't go and visit these sites, historical archaeological sites, until recently. I mean, only in the last sort of 10 years, they started reviving them. And for political reasons, because what Mohammed bin Salman wants to do is to decouple Saudi Arabia from Islam and the Wahhabi tradition. This decoupling pushes him to reinvent a new tradition and say that our roots are not 1400 years old, they go before that, and we should look at that pagan, in inverted commas, tradition.
And this is, of course, a well-worn sort of tradition of whether it's Egypt and the pharaonic sort of, or Reza Shah Pahlavi and those sorts of things.
And he's just a late comer to this game of nationalism. Yes, but I mean, the amazing thing is while there is a revival of these archaeological sites that had existed before Islam, there is a kind of systematic attempt to destroy some Islamic sites for sectarian reasons. So, for example, I'm sure you're aware of the renovation of Mecca under the guise of the renovation of the Haram and making it bigger to be able to accommodate the huge number of pilgrims. So there are people who got very upset because the house of Khadija was turned into a public toilet in the Haram, and also the destruction of the diversity of the Islamic schools of jurisprudence. So the Shafi'i, the Hanafi, the Maliki, which existed at the time and continue to provide ulama and religious scholars trained in these traditions. They were all suppressed, and only the Hanbali school survived because it is the school of the Wahhabiyya.
Right. I mean, I think there's so much there which is very valid criticism of a particularly unusual trend which emerges in 18th century Arabia, namely the movement of Muhammad al-Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. But in addition to that, what's interesting, I'm still going to sort of come back to this point about al-Ula and Madain Salih, is that I do think Muslims need to grapple with on a more granular level. So if you'll allow me, I'm just going to read the hadith in sort of Bukhari and Muslim, which would be considered canonical, at least for Sunnis. And it kind of explains that actually the behavior of the ulama, even the Wahhabi ulama, with respect to these places isn't necessarily completely an outlier. And so I think that sensitivity potentially has some benefits. The hadith says, لا تدخلوا على هؤلاء المعذبين إلا أن تكونوا باكين. Don't come upon these people except that you are crying. فإن لم تكونوا باكين فلا تدخلوا عليهم لا يصيبكم ما أصابهم. And then it says وفي رواية. So if you're not going to be crying as you enter, don't go there, lest you are afflicted with what afflicted them, meaning these were punished peoples. And the commentators, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the main commentator on Bukhari, and Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, both point out this is basically al-Hijr, which is what is today called Madain Salih. Just a couple more examples. So then it says in وفي رواية للبخاري ثم قنع بردائه وهو على الرحل ثم قنع رأسه فأسرع السير حتى أجاز الوادي. Then the Prophet covers his head and sort of rushes through the valley to get out of it. And in a version in Muslim, فأسرع حتى خلفها, and he rushed until he left it behind him. And so, in a sense, there's an explicit, prophetic sort of, I guess, directive saying that don't visit these places, because these are places that have been, in a sense, subject to punishment, and you don't want to be subject to that sort of punishment. And I personally read, lest you be subject to that punishment as being, lest you be subject to that in the hereafter, so to speak. So, I mean, in that particular instance, it works. Of course, these are the same people who are, undermining their own legitimacy by claiming that women can't drive, right? And my own, one of my shuyukh, I lived in Saudi Arabia. I did 4 years of my high school in Saudi Arabia, but then I also studied in Syria, and one of my shuyukh there his wife passed away in a car accident. She was driving, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with driving in any other Muslim country that I'm aware of. And now, alhamdulillah, not even in Saudi Arabia. So I just wonder, like, if, if our critique of the ulama in Saudi Arabia can, be sort of more effective, perhaps, by taking into consideration their sort of like terrain, so to speak.
Yes, but the thing is, yes, I understand. You're trying to play the devil's advocate.
Yes.
Okay, in a nutshell.
Right.
But I mean, from my anthropological training, Islam is text and context as well.
Sure.
So if, for example, to understand Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, you really need to understand the sociological makeup of that region where he grew up. And how he got his ilm, his knowledge. What books were available to him? Very little in terms of paper and ink and writing at the time in an arid zone in the 18th century. So, it is this ahistorical view of these texts that actually these muted modernists object to. It's taking texts out of their context and sort of, generalizing and reaching ahkam without the importance of context. And this is really what attracts me to the muted modernists, is that they all try to historicize Islam. Even the Quran, you read the surah and you need to know when it was revealed.
Absolutely.
There is a context.
Yeah.
Yes, but then, the difference is when you come to the core and the, al-munazzal,
الثوابت والمتغيرات.
Exactly. And then the muted modernists are called, very referred to in Saudi Arabia in very negative ways because they think that their fiqh and their knowledge is changing all the time. But they didn't, so
They're
for
not
example,
on
the death penalty. I mean, if we want to get serious, forget the archaeology, it's the death penalty. So it is legitimate for a Muslim to ask today in the 21st century that the death penalty is in Islam. As much as it is in the US and other countries.
Sure.
But if you have appointed judges by a repressive regime, isn't it better to suspend it rather than abolish it, given the context in which it takes place in a repressive, centralized monarchy? This is a legitimate question, and the ulama has a responsibility to answer that question. Because if we're not talking about a situation where judges are elected on the basis of their ilm, but they are elected on the basis of their loyalty, not to God, but to the king. And therefore, there is scope for discussing the death penalty in Islam.
Now, I mean, what's really interesting for me in that comment of yours is that, of course, these debates have been going on. It's the Saudi context where this is revolutionary, because these debates have been going on for over a century in a place like Egypt, right?
Absolutely,
so, mainstream Islamists or mainstream traditionalists in places like Egypt and Syria, I can think of two examples off the top of my head. Yusuf al-Qaradawi writing in the 80s, Sa'id Ramadan al-Bouti, writing in the 2000s, both say that the hudud in our contexts should be, not applied until we re-establish, a proper, healthy society which doesn't have poverty, which doesn't have all of these sorts of, problematic circumstances.
But also another example, Usaama, which is extremely important, that has been like at the fault line between the world of Islam and the West, and that is polygamy. Right? So if we want to get really, really talking about sensitive issues, I mean, I have not come across Alim, in the Arab world at least, who talks about it in ways that reflect contemporary issues.
Right.
It's like allowed for if you can be just, right? And this is the position for centuries.
Sure.
Right, but if you look at around the Muslim world, there are innovative ways of dealing with it. Right, and I give you an example, an anthropological example from my travel in Africa and other places. So in Senegal, they have solved the problem by saying that marriage is a contract in Islam. It's not forever. It's not like, it's a contract sanctioned, encouraged, etc. But a man and a woman sit and agree on this contract, and the woman could say, I want my marriage to be monogamous.
Sure.
And another woman might say, I accept that my marriage is polygamous.
Sure.
And therefore, if a man wants to marry a woman having signed a monogamous marriage, it's not possible. And if so basically there are ways of dealing with this.
Once again, it's unsurprising that this is in Senegal, because there's a very well-established opinion within the Maliki school, right? That the woman can stipulate certain things in the contract. I mean, a lot of scholars will say, actually, this is not something, she can stipulate it, but it doesn't have it doesn't prevent the man from marrying again. It just allows her to get out of that marriage when he marries again, so to speak. So,
or succumb to the pressure and give her consent.
The reality, of course, is that within discourses of the Ulama, these sorts of discourses, that particular position, as far as I understand, is as old as the Maliki school, basically. You find it probably
but this is the diversity, this is the beauty of the Islamic fiqh,
absolutely.
Whereby, can a woman marry herself, or does she need the guardian to sign? There are variations, but the Hanbali school says that no, even if you are 50-year-old, you need your guardian to marry you off. Whereas in other schools, it says that if you're Rashida, Imra'a Baligha Rashida, you can marry yourself. Therefore, that we lost that beauty in a country like Saudi Arabia.
I think this is the tragedy of Saudi Arabia. It's really and unfortunately, of course, those kind of extreme positions, in my view, are the ones that are, that create this prejudice about Islam and Muslims more generally. So, for example, on the question of the fact that hal mar'atu waliyatu nafsiha, that's a standard position within the Hanafi madhab, even though in general Hanafis from the South Asian community don't encourage or practice it. But technically, even someone who is not previously married, because in some of the other madhab, once you've been previously married, it's not a problem. You can always sort of contract a new marriage. But in the Hanafi madhab, of course, you can sort of contract a marriage on your own if you're a woman.
But then you get into very modern Salafis, especially anthropologically has been documented among young Muslims in Britain, for example. A marriage is between a man and a woman, and God is the witness.
No,
plus two friends.
No, two friends. Okay, so that's actually legitimate.
That's legitimate. You don't need... Yes, that's a Shari'i marriage, isn't it? And you are a alim. So basically, a man and a woman in university in Britain can marry, provided that God is the witness, and they bring two males or equivalent in number of females.
It's a fascinating conversation to have, because of course this is something which I've been talking about for a long time in the Muslim community, that actually that's zawaj is aqd ala hil al-istimta', and so you're supposed to sort of be connected to each other in some formal capacity in the Sharia to be able to have that sort of relationship. But that formal capacity is so easy to do. It's just a contract it's mithaq ghalidh, but it's just a contract between two people with two witnesses. And, it can be a nominal mahr. It's better to sort of be a bit more structured than that. And it's better, even in the Hanafi madhab, it's sunnah to keep the wali involved. But the thing is, in the UK, of course, there is a crackdown on unregistered marriages, right? So there's that dilemma as well.
Yes, but you mean from the British government?
From the government, yes.
Yes,
And-
but
and there are
that's
advocates
when we
within the
get
Muslim
into
community.
politics.
Yeah.
Then we get into politics.
Yeah.
So in many ways, so for example, culturally or socially, some parents are racist. They wouldn't accept that their Muslim girl marries anybody outside her ethnic group.
Or Asians
Sometimes
not
they
marrying black people, for example.
exactly.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if
there's
you're a
problem.
Somali and a Pakistani and you want to marry, and you have the mother refusing or the father refusing, this is a way out. But at the same time, when you want to protect the rights of women and men in marriage, and therefore we come into the modern institutions and the state, and the British government might object to this kind of marriage simply because they don't even recognize a Muslim marriage unless you go and register it in the local registry office, whereas Christian marriages in a church are automatically recognized. So that's a different problem that British Muslims or Muslims in other countries face. But when we're talking about a country like Saudi Arabia, when you banish all other ways of interpreting Islam and you stick to one, then you get the conditions for repression justified by the ulama.
Precisely. I mean, this is where a book like Ahmed Fakri Ibrahim's Pragmatism in Islamic Law is so fantastic. I think it was published, I want to say 2015, where he looks at the way in which scholars did what's called takhayyur between madhahib whenever sort of like, and this is in places like Egypt, where of course they have multiple sort of like madhahib operating in Sham and these sorts of places. And the Hijaz historically was like this, of course. One of the things that you talk about is how the suppression of Hijazi identity, the diversity of Islam is very sort of like clear to see in Hijazi culture, to a certain extent, even to this day. I have teachers from the Hijaz. And
because of the arrival of Muslims throughout, the centuries, who would come and study with, certain ulama, and then they bring in their own traditions as well.
So I'm really enjoying our conversation, and I'm sure this could go on for a lot longer. There have been a lot of questions, actually. So, and a fair few comments as well. And in some instances, they're kind of just saying things like, Adam Zed is saying Assalamu alaikum, and also Black Piper saying salam. If it's all right, Dr. Madawi, I will put some of these questions to you, perhaps.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And so we've got a question from someone with the screen name Black Viper, who is asking, if one goes through Western university system to study, say, Islamic theology to a PhD level, would they be classified as an alim? Very, very interesting question, of course. I wonder what you would say to that.
I think, obviously, there is, in any religious tradition, you need Ijazah, no?
Right.
In order to issue fatwa.
Right.
At the moment.
Right.
With the development of modern institutions.
Right.
And it depends what you study. If you study theology or religious studies.
Right.
And I think it all depends on the context, but most of the historical tradition was one alim will teach another alim, and the tradition continues.
Right.
And then they have ijazah, they have authentication, I think.
Right.
So studying the anthropology of religion is not going to make you alim, or perhaps taking a couple of courses in religious studies is not going to give you that authority.
Right.
But again, if you're a Salafi, for example, you subscribe to the fact that if you're a literate person, you could read the tradition.
Right.
And you could cut all the intermediaries.
All sorts of problems with that. Naturally, we can.
Yes,
envisage.
but it also, it can be liberating, of course. It can be liberating. So it's if you're a speaker of the language of Islam in a way that is not superficial. I mean, you could read the newspaper in Arabic. That doesn't mean you could read the Quran and understand the references.
Right.
So you need that kind of proficiency. Then you could read the commentators and you make your own decision. And this is the the tradition, I would say, that allows Islam to endure despite the onslaught of on it by the governments where it is a dominant religion, and also by outsiders, because the tradition carries its own renewal.
Right.
I don't need to go to a alim to know my rights and duties as a Muslim. Right?
I mean,
I could read them.
This is the power of a certain type of Salafi orientation, the type that
Absolutely.
you can think of associated with the traditions of Rashid Rida, for example, and to a certain extent, Salman al-Auda, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and so on. They would see themselves as a Salafi of a certain kind, not the Salafi of the sort of Wahhabi Najdi variety. But let me just actually, if it's all right, I'll point out, and you'll forgive the sort of self-plug. I did a book review of a work of Timothy Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad, who is a theologian at Cambridge. And in that review, one of the things I pointed out was actually, even within the tradition, there's a recognition of the contingency of the structures that they've created for conferring authority. So the Ijazah itself is sort of historicized and contextualized by someone as authoritative as Jalaluddin al-Suyuti. So Suyuti in his Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, and I can send you sort of like the translation, it's from Scott, sorry, I have to check up the author's name again, but he's written a wonderful social history of the Ijazah system in the Isnad, published just in the last year or two. And he basically, Garrett Davidson, he's quoting from Suyuti, where Suyuti says, actually, you don't need an Ijazah these are conventions that we've come up with.
Yes.
But there's nothing in the Quran and the Sunnah which says that someone who hasn't arrived at a sufficient level of knowledge cannot themselves give fatwa, even, he's saying.
Yes.
Now, the danger of that in our own age, of course, is I remember being on a panel with Usaama Hassan, who is, he used to work at the Quilliam Foundation. Alhamdulillah, that's gone now. But, it's one of these kind of, what can I say, like these counterterrorism sort of think tanks that are run by reformed radicals, and sometimes some of these institutions are not very healthy in my view. And he was basically saying, look, we can come up with all sorts of like newfangled interpretations. And I kind of challenged him, and I said, yeah, I think you can if it's well grounded in arguments that can be sort of it's in the public domain, it can be open to contest, etc. But you can't just make up stuff because you are being directed by a certain teleological sort of like result. Because that's precisely what ISIS does. And we condemn ISIS rightly for that reason. And I mean, that was kind of my argument there.
Yes. It's a big question.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one that Muslims face. Do you open the gates of Ijtihad or do you close them? Have they been closed?
They've never been
right?
closed. I mean,
they've never been closed. But exactly. But,
but there is a culture of thinking they are like that. I mean,
yes, there are things that are beyond debate, and it's taken for granted that we will not discuss them anymore. But Ijtihad is a continuous process, and of course the dark side is you get others who interpret it, and not superficially, I would say, in ways that suit their own purposes, obviously. But I think this is the strength of the Islamic tradition. And then, it is not always going to be positive. You always, that deliberation has that potential of democratizing debate about Islam and Muslims, but at the same time, there's the dark side of any kind of approach.
Any tradition, of course.
Exactly. Yes.
The Enlightenment tradition, if you take the word of the critical theorists, and I find them compelling, resulted as much in liberalism as it did in Nazism.
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, it's like modernity itself, to go back to the muted modernist and the book, modernity itself has its challenges. And this is why quite a lot of people perhaps want to opt out of modernity and modernism. And go back to a literal interpretation that is black and white. halal and haram. But you need a certain
you
level
can't,
of education.
Yeah.
And because life is fluid and it's changing, and we're going to have situations that the tradition maybe didn't deal with, and then you need qiyas, and you need all sorts of mechanisms and methodology to deal with the real world, and a real world that is changing in a very, very fast way. I mean, like Twitter, for example, you get the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz Ibn Baz, issuing a fatwa saying Twitter is actually a divisive tool. Abdulaziz Al-Sheikh, yes, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. So he needs to give an opinion on Twitter. But what he had in mind is that Twitter can be a subversive way of criticizing the king and precipitating demonstrations and protests. And therefore, he feels like he needs to give an opinion on Twitter and says that you avoid this social media. It's bad. It's bad, and Islamically bad, not like my opinion is like you should avoid it, it's really bad for you. No, he gives the sinful. Islamic, it's sinful therefore. Or for example, when he says, a demonstration is haram.
Right.
Yeah. And this is the muted modernists challenge that from the Islamic tradition, because they are dealing with the Wahhabi interpretations that trying to use an-nas, trying to use the text in order to prohibit something which shouldn't be prohibited. So, for example, Abdullah al-Hamid uses the word rahat. Rahat is an Arabic word, which means that people come together to the ruler as a group. And he says this is a demonstration because there is strength in being together. You don't go to the ruler one at a time because you become lonely and vulnerable. And he might just dismiss you or put you in prison, which is exactly what happened to Abdullah al-Hamid. And unfortunately, he died in prison. Yeah. He died in prison because of his, in inverted comma, revolutionary way of looking at the tradition and trying to find way out of the deadlock that had made Saudi Arabia one of the most authoritarian and repressive countries in the Muslim world.
And this is precisely, I think, illustrative of the kind of the difficulty that modernity has thrust upon Muslims as a whole, that you have this kind of statist ulama class constricting and narrowing the Islamic tradition to political ends. And I, in my own writings, and I have in Masouda Bano's latest edited volume on Salafism, I have a chapter which talks specifically about the obedience and rebellion dilemma. And my own reading is that actually I don't articulate it quite like this and that because it's a study of Salman al-Awda's book, and I drew on your sort of muted modernists for that as well. My sort of contention would be that contemporary Islam and contemporary ulama who are sort of subordinate to the state have actually manufactured this new myth of obedience, which doesn't exist in my reading in the classical tradition. Meaning, in the classical tradition, there was a presumption of obedience to one's rulers. But in the same way that you and I think, okay, we need to obey the government when it sets down certain laws. Like in Britain, we do that as a matter of course. But that doesn't mean that every single aspect of the government's behavior is not open to any question or protest. We can actually criticize the government.
Yes, but I mean, they use the old classical terminology, which is frightening, al-khuruj al-hakim, which is... historically, it was used to refer to armed rebellion against the ruler, not a tweet and not an article written in a newspaper. But in order to go back to the principle of sadd al-dhara'i', for example, you can't criticize the ruler openly in an article in the newspaper. That would be undermining his authority. Yeah, but they forget a whole tradition which says that the rule the jihad is actually
أفضل الجهاد كلمة حق
حق
عند
عند
سلطان
سلطان
جائر.
جائر,
Right,
you know, and how many Muslim scholars had their heads chopped off simply because they practiced exactly that right, you know, and therefore this khuruj ala al-hakim is a frightening sort of concept that is imposed on modern times, modern writing, modern debate and deliberation, and therefore it is outlawed. But you can't actually. And also, what about the red lines, crossing red lines? For example, what is a red line in the Saudi imagination? The red line is to say their king was wrong in initiating this policy. That's a red line. So he's always right. He's ma'soom. Therefore, he doesn't commit any kind.
Of course.
Well, this is blasphemous, of course. Right? So you go at the full circle. You get to the stage where you make the king above everybody, and also sacrosanct.
Yes, if
it's the divine right of kings. Then
right. I mean, this is kind of my. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to sort of point out that this is precisely the argument that I lay out in my book. That in a sense, there's a divinization of the state, or in the case of, you know, a place like Saudi Arabia, would be of the king. In a place like Egypt, it would be of the military. And
the other concept is fitna. The word fitna, discord. They blow it out of proportion, in which, you know, like criticizing the housing policy of the government becomes discord because it creates division. And the fear of division, the fear that any kind of debate would lead to division, ahzab or tahazzub.
And this is the irony, of course, because if you're conversant with these concepts like saddu dhari'a, like maslaha, like fitna, you can also recognize that they are also potentially weapons against the government, because the government's behavior is a dhari'a ila al-fitna. You know, it's a dhari'a to creating unrest in society. It's a dhari'a to creating... And
justice, for example, when you have injustices inflicted on society, isn't that discord? That's the argument that the muted modernist put forward, or imposing Sharia with the sword, which is very important, because Saudi Arabia prided itself before Mohammed bin Salman that it was ruling according to Sharia. And Sharia has to be enforced. So the muted modernists I discuss in the book say that you can't. That's an oppression. Sharia can't be imposed like this. It needs to come from the will of the people. The concept of wali al-amr, the guardian. The wali al-amr is used as your father if you're a woman, or brother or husband, but also the ruler is wali al-amr. So wali al-amr, Abdullah al-Hamid said, is Ummah is wali al-amr, which means the Muslim community through its representative rather than the persona of the king.
So, I mean, once again, I'm going to actually sort of argue that these ideas are found within the classical Islamic tradition as well. And there's actually reasonably good work at this point with people like Patricia Krona and her Medieval Islamic Political Thought, fantastic book, which covers all sorts of different viewpoints, but also has the section on Sunnism talks about the way in which, you know, the notion of the Ummah actually having the sort of authority to appoint the Caliph ultimately. Those sorts of ideas, although people like Andrew March in his recent book, Caliphate of Man, sovereignty of God and those sorts of concepts, says that there's been a transformation in the understanding. But that transformation also is indigenous to the tradition, where now the notion of, the Ummah choosing its ruler is, part and parcel of the discourse. I mean, as you have suggested, Saudi Arabia is somewhat late to the party in some of this discourse, actually. But it's been in the air for decades at this point.
Oh, absolutely. I think from the 19th century, these concepts were debated elsewhere, but not in Saudi Arabia. And they are debated on the basis of going even further in time to the early writings. But, unfortunately, these debates had vanished from the public sphere in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And, when it comes to calls from outside, that Islam needs a reformation. I mean, I find this extremely ridiculous. When people think that, because we had a reformation in Christianity, we need a reformation in Islam, without actually going into the tradition, looking at the original sources, looking at the debates that used to take place. But they think that there's only one way of marrying religion to modern wife, and it is the Christian way.
Right. I mean, this is part of the Eurocentrism of the social sciences. I really like the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty. He's got a book called Provincializing Europe, and he complains about the way in which all our ways of thinking are inevitably embedded in a Eurocentric paradigm, because the humanities and social sciences emerge out of European knowledge. And
they emerged out of the European Enlightenment. All of these disciplines, whether politics, philosophy, not philosophy, but sociology, anthropology, all of them, late 19th century. Basically.
You could even say philosophy as we know it today is the remnant of, natural philosophy. The parts that didn't become science remain to be philosophy today. The thing about that is, of course, that one of the things that I find interesting in Dipesh Chakrabarty, that particular book of his, Provincializing Europe, is that he complains that, because he's an Indian intellectual and a post-colonial theorist, he says that, well, no one looks at the Indian tradition of philosophers 500 or 1,000 years ago and engages with it as though it's a living tradition. And for me, it's actually the Islamic tradition is just like that. People engage it. And that's why I think there's so much opportunity for Muslim scholars and social scientists like yourself to do that blending work that you embark on in some of this literature. And I hope I can contribute to kind of following those footsteps. I did want to ask a few more questions from the audience, if that's all right. Someone was asking, what is Professor Madawi Al-Rasheed's definition of Wahhabism? Because you've obviously used that concept throughout. Did you want to maybe give a brief?
The Wahhabi tradition is a name also invented by the people who didn't agree with Wahhabi tradition. And, the first person who didn't agree with it was the brother of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who used it as that in the title of a book, to debate and critique his brother. But then the word was used by others. And as I mentioned early on, the name is not used by the Wahhabis themselves. We call them Wahhabis, and it is a diverse tradition also. The Wahhabiyya is not one. It is, there are multiple voices. Remember, it started in the 18th century. And until now, there are multiple voices within the Wahhabi tradition. But there are common denominator. And the common denominator is as a methodology, as a manhaj of, they sort of go back in their interpretations to the Hanbali fiqh, and to privileging a literal interpretation of the Islamic texts. So, for example, they are notorious. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, if you go to his work as the founder of the movement, in Kitab al-Tawheed, on shirk, on blasphemy, the way he deals with them are his interpretation of this original Islamic texts that existed and were associated with Ibn Hanbal and later Ibn Taymiyyah. So, for example, simple differences between the Wahhabis and the majority of Sunni Muslims, the Ash'aris. So, for example, anthropomorphism, when we talk about istawa ala al-arsh, or God's hand. Exactly. So these were theological issues that go back earlier than the
Right,
18th
right,
century, and they didn't invent it themselves, but then they developed it. They developed the tradition and dealt with issues that were relevant to them. So, for example, a question would come to one of the Saudi muftis, Ibn Baz, who was, who passed away in 1999.
Right.
So, is it legitimate for a Muslim to travel to the land of kufr?
Right.
Right? Land of blasphemy, which means that if you're a Saudi student or a Muslim, is it legitimate for you to go to Britain to study or do your business or live there, choose to live there?
Right.
And then they give their opinion on that. In fact, Ibn Baz says that only if you have to.
Right.
Right. So this is a modern question that had equivalents in ancient time. The early Muslims had to do business and travel. In fact, they had to take refuge with the kuffar, according to the Saudi interpretation of who the kuffar are.
Right.
Yeah. So for example, for Muslims today, the kuffar are not the Christians and the Jews. Right? But in the Wahhabi tradition, the land of kuffar is Britain. Could be the land of kuffar in the Wahhabi tradition because it's not a Muslim country. Right. Whereas the early Muslims who went to Abyssinia, they went to a Christian king seeking refuge. The Prophet didn't think of them as going to the land of kuffar. They went to the land of the people of the book. Right? So this is the differences between the Wahhabis and others who may had roots in the early Islamic times.
So, I mean, I should point out, I mean, like things like Darul Kufr and Darul Islam, these are istilah of the fuqaha which developed.
Well, exactly,
And, I mean, they have their own context. They mean certain things in certain discourses. But
and certain historical time.
One thing I would add is, as a South Asian, I generally tend to avoid using the term Wahhabi in my everyday speech, even though I use it sometimes in my academic writing because it's widely accepted. But calling someone Wahhabi is such a bad slur in South Asian culture that it's not a very nice thing to say.
But I mean, this is this. Let me ask you the question: is this a recent development, or had it always been since the 18th century?
It's something which has been around for several generations, I would say, because basically, you have a major sort of like a divide in the Indian subcontinent is between the Brelvis and the Deobandis. You'll be familiar with that.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And the Brelvis sometimes to attack the Deobandis will say that they're Wahhabi, which is in some respects like extremely vicious theological attack. I mean, I liked your pointing out that the history of what's sometimes referred to as Madhab al-Salaf in Aqidah is much older than Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and the direction in which the Saudis have taken it and the Wahhabis, so to speak, is, I think, it doesn't do justice to the brilliance of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah. So Karl Sharif al-Tubki has recently published his study of Ibn Taymiyyah's masterwork, Dar' al-Ta'arud bayn al-Aqli wal-Naql, a 10-volume philosophical masterpiece. And, it, I think, shows that, his conception of God's attributes was not literalist by any, way that we sort of very often commonly say it. And I think it's so sophisticated that it's often not understood by his advocates in the kingdom, so to speak. So
but I can understand the sensitivity of South Asian Muslims, especially, I mean, like for example, the al-Mawlid. When Muslims celebrate the birth of the Prophet, this wasn't allowed in Saudi Arabia. There are only 2 Eid to be celebrated.
That's actually part of the reason that they call the Bandis Wahhabi, because they don't accept the Mawlid as well.
Exactly. And therefore, yes, I mean, the schism, when the West talks about the Wahhabis, in inverted commas, they talk about sectarianism. So, for example, their position on Muslim minorities, such as the Shia, the Ismailis, the Sufis, etc. I mean, the Wahhabis had very, very negative things to say about Muslim minorities who had existed.
And they killed them.
Yes,
the
but
attacks on this, the Shia shrines in Iraq and things like this.
yes, in the early 19th century, they call them. There are some Muslims who are called innovators, Ahl al-Bida', and there are Muslims that perhaps you and I consider them as Muslim, but they consider them as outside the realm of Islam. And they lump them together with the Khawarij, the historical Khawarij, not the modern Khawarij. And engaging in takfir. And this is extremely dangerous. The takfir had its own context historically, and who issues it, who carries out the hukum after takfir. All this needs really like deep knowledge of Islam and its tradition, rather than the superficial mass education in schools and universities that the states in Muslim countries enforced.
Yeah,
it gave them some literacy in religious knowledge without actually the depth.
Right.
It is a problem of education.
I agree, and it's also it's when you mark out certain types of education as illegitimate that you don't allow for that broadening of perspectives, of viewpoints, and unfortunately, of course, as a number of scholars, including people like Hatim al-Auni and others, have pointed out, the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia cannot disown ISIS because it comes out of a comparable tradition to their own. I'm really thoroughly enjoying this. I wonder, though, because I've taken a lot of your time, if you'd be willing to maybe entertain one more question from.
Yes, go ahead.
It's a tough one in some respects, and I'm sure it will elicit some reflection on all our parts. But how are the ulama responding to cultural events in the country, especially concerts and tourism? How are ordinary people? No, actually, this isn't too complicated. How are ordinary people embracing new government policies? So this is something which is well within your sort of books.
Well, the ulama of Saudi Arabia at the moment had gone underground, and it is going back to how the ulama in all times reacted to change. Such as, for example, now you have rave parties in the desert, you have street concerts, you have Western singers, pop stars coming to the country, etc. So there are political, economic reasons for this. But the ulama had either gone silent completely, which is a position that you can adopt from an Islamic point of view. Like if you can't, and there is a danger on your life if you speak out, some people might يعتزل,
It's not the position of Ahmed ibn Hanbal, but fair enough.
No, it's not. But they could go and say that we can't say anything now, and that's a position acceptable within the Sunni tradition.
Absolutely.
You can, and others who had spoken against that, a lot of them ended up in prison. So that's the ulama position at the moment. In terms of society, you have a substantial section who is thrilled by the innovations, by the ability to join, a world mass culture. And you see them participating. Others had, shunned these events and stayed at home. But there's no open debate, to discuss them or see if people really want them.
And this is the point that you repeatedly make in this book, which is that, is this how you're supposed to reform a society? By top-down, quote-unquote, reform?
But also reform Islam. Is reforming Islam a process that involves putting those ulama who don't accept or have a different point of view in prison? So is that reform? And then you get into sort of the old school of Oriental despotism.
Right.
That, in order to reform a society that is so backward, in inverted commas, so radical and so conservative, you need a certain amount of coercion.
Right.
And this is really like ridiculous argument
Right.
that, in order to reform Muslim societies, you need a top-down reform. And there are classical examples where this didn't actually work. I mean, we saw what happened in Turkey in the 20th century, what happened in Iran in also the 20th century, top-down, forced change without, engaging society, those who are affected by it.
Right. And I mean, in Iran, in a sense, you have a radical sort of like rebound from that. But even in Turkey, to a certain extent, I mean, in Turkey, I sometimes observe Turkey now, and with a good deal of concern, considering sort of the way in which Erdogan behaves. But in a sense, its initial manifestation of the reaction to that suppression was something which a lot of us looked with hope towards, actually. But
Usaama, the muted modernists touch on a very important point that avoids this kind of situation. Namely, what they are saying is leave religion to civil society. When the state interferes and controls religion, you're going to have very, very bad mutations. And also you're going to have violence and terrorism.
This is another point you make. I mean, it's so reminiscent of Nasser's prisons, right?
Yes.
The way in which they're behaving, and people, senior members in the Ritz-Carlton situation, senior sort of like Saudis died in there. But if that's how they're treating like millionaires, billionaires, and powerful people, how are they treating the average Saudi in some of these prisons? What sort of torture was Lujain al-Hadhlul put through, for example? And there were visible signs of torture on her body, as far as I understand. So that, of course, we know what's happened in recent history when that was done in other parts of the world. What's to say that that's not going to have... and you give a bit of a frightening prognosis, in a sense, of that situation. And we hope that, in a sense, the Saudi... so let me maybe conclude with this question, like, what hope do you see for the future? You yourself are involved in initiatives which I admire from, as a non-Saudi. But what sort of hope is there in the Saudi context? What can people do about the current circumstance? And what can I do, for example, as an academic, who's not a Saudi?
Well, I mean, I think, the Saudis themselves, they have to take the initiative to change the conditions that actually enslaves them, suppresses their rights, not according to a Western model, but according to the Islamic tradition that they respect and subscribe to. So I see that the future for a country like Saudi Arabia is to have a strengthening of the debate that I discuss in Muted Modernist, and create a civil society that is effective. But it's a challenge to create civil society in an authoritarian context, obviously. It's like, who comes first? Does the freedom come before civil society, or civil society leads to freedom? It's a debate that has, worried social scientists and political scientists. But without that, the conditions of repression continue. And historically, the repression was justified and legitimized using Islam. And therefore, my view is that the liberation will have to come from that field rather than importing something from outside. It's not going to be legitimate in the eyes of the people who for generations had been socialized into an Islamic tradition. I think the solution should be in developing these arguments, taking them further, then creating yet another civil society to be able to push a new agenda.
That's a very...
and also, as us, we are in the West, and the struggle is on different levels. We have the freedom to actually write and think and publish, but we are also caught we spend quite a lot of time debunking arguments about Islam and Muslims that come
Right,
from our host societies,
right.
where we live, and
Right.
at the same time we're attacked by people in our home countries as scholars, academics who have actually sold their soul to
Westernized,
the
no
westernized.
Islamic, yes,
So,
yes.
we are in a very difficult situation, and I'm sure you and I and many others, although I don't have the legitimacy to be a religious scholar, I'm just an anthropologist of religion and politics. So we are caught, and I'm not sure if you feel the same as well.
So, I mean, just a point about sort of, I think there's something also to be said about the authority of scholarship, including anthropology, social sciences, empirical knowledge, that shouldn't and cannot be dismissed just because someone isn't an alim. And I think
No.
increasingly people will recognize that. And ironically, of course, in light of the kind of attempts at kind of secular reform that MBS is trying to bring about, then people should be taking you even more seriously, right? Because then religion isn't sort of like not everyone has to be an alim to be sort of like making authoritative statements.
Yes, but I wouldn't feel comfortable, considering myself as an authority on Islam. I will never be able to do that simply because I'm humble in the face of a rich tradition
Right.
that had taken, more than 14th century to crystallize. My expertise in observing and looking at empirical data in order to reach a conclusion about what works and what didn't work.
I mean, you don't need to necessarily give ahkam shar'iyya or fatawa or something like this, but I think the interrogation that you put, the sort of the kingdom through in its current guise, and the voice that you're giving to an English-speaking audience is extremely valuable. I mean, just to reflect on your question, which I think you're directing towards me in terms of thinking about, do I experience that sort of double pressure? And I think it's extremely challenging for Muslims in the West. I'm born and raised in this country. I consider myself of this country, but I also recognize that I'm not seen by many people in this country to be of this country because of a kind of Islamophobic sort of discourse, which is the basis of the current prime minister being in power and saying things like, Muslims wearing niqab are like, the terrible things he said directly attacking Muslim women, for example. So I think that I don't have, alhamdulillah, I pray that, things are made less precarious for someone like yourself, because you would be in the crosshairs of a sort of like government which has shown itself capable of doing things to people like Jamal Khashoggi, and that's something which I don't worry about quite as much because I'm not Saudi. I'm not someone who's, but at the same time, as a consequence of that, I see it as a greater duty for myself to sort of engage scholars like yourself, and to the extent that I can, encourage people to read your work, and I hope in a small way contribute to that resistance. In that way, I think that the pressures that I face aren't as great as the ones that you do. But I do feel.
Well, I mean, you never know what kind of levels of pressure one can face. Okay, in my case, it's obvious. I have a state that continues to attempt to hack my phone, and even issued a warning about the publication of certain books I have done in terms of taking disciplinary action against me, hacking my phone, 2018, 19, hacking my Twitter account, all that. Yes, but also in your case, I would see that, perhaps because you have that training of a alim, it's not unimaginable that issue fatwa against you. If, for
and
example,
I take that as I'd be very honored.
Well, yeah.
I've put on the cover of my book Mohammed bin Zayed. I mean, that's asking for trouble to a certain extent, but this is a book which takes on the Islamic scholarly tradition. As an alim, highlight my positionality in the same way that you do in your introduction, and I point out, actually, I can't engage in this conversation, the same point that you're making, as though I'm some kind of, dispassionate, unengaged
Yes,
scholar.
because your identity is a two-way process. This
Right,
is what we
right.
learn in anthropology.
right.
You could say that you're British, but if the
Right.
society doesn't
Right.
recognize you as such, then you could say whatever you are.
Right,
It's
right.
always you need the other to recognize you as such.
Fascinating. Right,
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, I hope and pray that any pressures that come our way, and I admire your resilience, and I take that inspiration from it. But any pressures that come our way to sort of limit our ability to try and enable reform in our parts of the world, that we're able to withstand them, bitawfiqillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I really am grateful for your time and your insights, and your writing these wonderful books. I mean, they're just fantastic, and I encourage everyone to try and get their hands on them, try and read them. Even if you can't buy
thank
them,
you.
borrow them from the libraries and have a read.
Thank you so much for your time and the questions and the careful reading of these texts, and I look forward to reading more of your work.
Barakallah fikum. Barakallah
And
fikum. Jazakumullah khair.
hopefully, we
will be in touch. Please stick
contribute.
Inshallah. Please stick around. I'm going to just sort of put an end to the podcast, and I'll just say my goodbyes properly in a moment, inshallah. But for everyone who's joined us, and thank you so much for all of your engagement. You actually sent a lot of wonderful comments and questions. I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but I hope that, someone's incident, I'll just share this, saying that, enjoyed this discussion tremendously. Someone else is saying thank you at Usaama and Dr. Madawi. And we really enjoy your sort of engagement with us. And I just want to conclude with saying stay safe, take care of yourselves, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you.